Thank you, Kim, and thank you very much to the organizers and for inviting me, and to everyone who's joining my talk. So this project is just is joint work with Esteban Mendes from the Central Bank of Costa Rica. The effect of large-scale multinational investments in developing countries remains an important open question that is subject to debate. There are pretty much two opposite sides of this debate. One that argues that these companies have market power, they can lower wages and lead to the exploitation and underdevelopment of their host economies, versus another one that argues they actually lead to job creation and undertake investments and can lead to long-run growth. Overall, the evidence is mixed, mainly because there are challenges to identifying the effects of these firms. And if you're thinking about long run, it is also challenging to, even if you could identify an effect, follow its evolution over time. This is for FDI in general. Now there's a particular type of FDI that, even though it has been pervasive both historically and in recent years, has not really been studied by the literature. And that is land concessions. Just to give you an idea about how pervasive these land concessions have been, just in the last 20 years, over 64 million acres of land have been assigned as land concessions to foreigners in developing countries for agricultural activities alone. This paper studies what are the short and long-run effects of these large investment projects on development, using evidence from one of the largest multinational companies of the 20th century, the United Fruit Company. In Costa Rica, one of these so-called banana republics, and if this term rings a bell, this company is where this term originated from. In Costa Rica, the firm had a large land concession, where it was the only employer from 1899 to 1984. To identify this firm's effect on development, this paper will use two different approaches that will complement each other. First, we will use an empirical approach to identify the firm's local effect, and then we will use these local estimates to help us discipline a general equilibrium model that will allow us to speak to aggregate effects. Like more in detail, this presentation is going to be divided in three main parts. In the first part, we're going to identify the firm's local effect. And in particular, the setting is going to be well suited to identify this effect using a geographic regression discontinuity design. For three main reasons, all of which are novel within the RD literature. The first one is that we collected census data that is georeferenced by census blocks, so we pretty much know the exact location of each household. Moreover, this data starts more than a decade before the company stops operations and goes on even 3 decades after its closure. So we can see how the effect of the company is evolving over time, both before and after it exits. Also, we identify a segment of the land concessions border that was redrawn due to some ambiguities in the initial contract. And we will be very specific about how this was redrawn, but for now, I'm just gonna say this. And given these characteristics, we can estimate a causal effect of the United Fruit by comparing outcomes of households that are within close proximity to the border, but on different sites. As a preview, we actually find a large positive and persistent effect. Now, I'm just gonna take a minute to have a brief discussion of what the thought experiment should be here in this part of the paper. We have this regression discontinuity. What you should not have in mind is that on one side of this border, you have what would have happened to Costa Rica if the company had never existed or had never entered. This sort of parallel universe is impossible to capture with DRD. We will speak about it with the model, through the lens of the model, but not with DRD. With DRD, what you should have in mind is you have two neighbors, one like on both sides of the border. On one side, households are under the direct influence of the company, and we will be specific about what this influence is. On the other side, there aren't. And we see that households on the United Fruit Company side systematically outperform their neighbors. And then the next part, the next two parts of the paper are about understanding why. So the second part of the paper tries to understand what is the mechanism using quantitative and qualitative evidence. I'm going to try to convince you that large investments in amenities like hospitals and schools to attract workers given a high competition in the labor market are what actually led to these differences in outcomes that we documented in the first part. And we're also gonna briefly talk about some alternative hypotheses, in particular that the results are not due to selective migration or negative spillovers from the company to its neighbors.
Diana?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but you kind of said what we shouldn't think, and then what we could learn from the regression discontinuity. But what can you kind of explain why we shouldn't think what you said we shouldn't think? How you're going
because yes, thank you. So because these two regions are right next to each other, so even through general equilibrium effects, like workers moving from one side to the other one, there could be an effect of just being next to the company. So in the model is, and this is kind of my next bullet point, consistent with the local RDs. What is going to happen in the model is not that on one side you have what would have happened with no company. You have literally the region that is next to the company, and that's what's going to be calibrated. The model incorporates this mechanism I described in the second part. It's consistent with the,
A clarifying question. So what exactly are these land concessions, and what is the difference between being on one side of the border versus the other?
Yes.
Access to hospitals.
We're going to go into more details about that later. This is just a brief outline, but yeah, sure. We're going to be super specific about that. Just
so is the land concession sale, or is it a 99-year rental, or what is it?
In this case, it's going to be technically the company was there for 85 years. After that, the lease expires, and the company has to leave. So it's like depending on the case, land concessions can sometimes be renewed after the lease ends and things like that. But yeah, land concession is so the government needs, like in the case of Costa Rica, they needed to build a railroad. They didn't have money to pay for it, so they give this land in concession in exchange of these investors building the railroad. Yeah. The model is going to be consistent with this RD result. It's going to allow us to estimate the aggregate effect of the company, and also to run some counterfactual exercises that are going to help us understand what key elements of the setting are the ones that led to this positive effect, how as we change them, the effect can become negative, and therefore inform some policy recommendations. Okay, so this is the roadmap of the talk. Now I'm going to move forward to talking about the historical background. So we're going to talk a little bit more about land concessions. So the company received a large land concession. It was 9% of the national territory, extremely large, in exchange for building a railroad in 1884. And it started production as the United Fruit Company in 1899. Some important details about this concession that are going to matter for the identification strategy are: first, that the land was unpopulated when the concession started. Second, that the government did not invest in this land during the concession. So if there was going to be any type of public good, it had to be provided by the company. And finally, this is very important, that all workers were required to live within the concession. So there was an even live between working for the company and living inside the concession. Why? Well, first, the company provided housing only for workers and their families, not to external people. But why were all workers required to live inside? The reason was mainly malaria and yellow fever. The experience of the Panama Canal kind of informed the world, but also the company, that if population is fluctuating from one location to another one, something that maybe now and today is also applies. If population is fluctuating, diseases can spread. And so they wanted everyone to stay within the concession's border and not go in and out, because then they could bring in diseases, in particular this malaria and yellow fever that were very contagious. The company was pretty large with respect to the Costa Rican economy. It employed up to 20% of the agricultural labor force and produced 42% of exports on average. Eventually operated in 12 different countries in Latin America. It had its headquarters in Boston and even ranked within top 40 companies in the New York Stock Exchange. And finally, when bankrupt in 1984, leaving the area of our study after experiences some financial difficulties because of expropriations in several countries, a series of hurricanes that destroyed the plantations, and some scandals that had to do with corruption.
Diana, I have a question. How is the construction of the railroad, the location of the railroad associated with the land concessions?
Let me show you. Here. So the railroad was connecting the capital, that is San Jose, right here in blue, with the main port, that is like the main port in the Atlantic, that is over here. So the concession is this area that you see in black. So like the company, as part of the deal, could use this railroad. In all the regressions that I'm going to show you, we're controlling for distance to the railroad. We do several robustness checks to make sure the railroad is not driving the result. But yeah, the idea of the railroad was connecting this capital with the Caribbean Sea.
So there are other areas which, in black there, which seem to not be discontinuous? I mean,
yes. I'm gonna get to that in a couple of slides. But yeah, you're totally right. That was the point of like showing you.
Okay.
Yeah, this with the overlay. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Yes, but I'll get back to. Okay, in terms of data, so this project involved a serious effort in terms of collecting and digitizing data. And the first thing that was collected were maps of the United Fruit Company's plantations from original copies. There's some funny stories about this if we want to talk about it later. Also historical data, including public expenditures by municipality and by type of expenditure for almost the entire tenure of the company from 1914 to 1984. We digitized every year. Also, annual reports from like company annual reports for its entire tenure that also include details about their expenditures by type and by division. And census data. And this census data starts actually in the 1920s, but doesn't have this census block geocode. The census data that has this very detailed census block geocode starts in the 70s, so almost like over a decade before the company stops operating. This data, part of it had to be digitized, including the first two censuses. And with it, we defined what the Economic Commission for Latin America calls dimensions of unsatisfied basic needs, that basically tell you the quality of certain types of services that people have in their households. So in particular, the 4 dimensions that we look at are housing, that is basically the quality of the house; health, that includes type of sewage, access to clinic, last check with the general practitioner; education, that's basically years of schooling; and consumption, that is an indirect measure that considers the number of income recipients, their school, and their number of dependents. Then with these 4 dimensions, we consider a household poor if it has at least one need that is unsatisfied, and the total number of unsatisfied basic needs gives you like an intensive margin of poverty. Okay, so for the empirical strategy to estimate the short and long run effects, ideally, what we would like to do is just to compare outcomes of census blocks just across the United Fruit Company's border. The problem, as we mentioned like a couple of minutes ago, is that the land that was assigned to the company that you can see in black was not random. I'm going to do this again so you can see it. It's basically flatlands that are close to coastal areas. And so instead, what we do is we identify a quasi-random land assignment in a segment of this border. Let me be more specific. In 1884, the concessions contract was not precise about what its northern boundary was going to be. While the company argued that some land was part of the initial concession, the government disagreed with this view and didn't think it was part of the concession. So in 1904, shortly after the company started operating in 1899, the concessions were subject to revision, and some land was expropriated and given back to the United Fruit. Which land? Roughly the land that was south from a river. And so why roughly? Because there were already some pre-existing plots of land. And even though the agreement was to roughly follow the river, they didn't break any of these plots apart. So if, if following the river implied that this plot was not going to be part of the United Fruit, it wasn't. And so it is this like interaction between the pre-existing plots and how they intersect the river, the one that determines ultimately the shape of the border in this area. So because we have this, say, quasi-random assignment in this particular part of the segment of the boundary, we're going to run our regression discontinuity here. We also run the RD in the entire boundary as a robustness, but in this area, we're sure, like because of the way the assignment was made, but also because when we check that geographic characteristics balance, they do balance at the boundary. So if we stay within 10 kilometers of this boundary segment, nothing is significant. Like inside and outside, you have the same elevation, slope, temperature. If we go all the way to 15, actually differences start being significant, and that's because there's a mountain that starts forming outside. And so all our main regressions are going to stay within 10 kilometers of this boundary. Now, because the data is so detailed, even if we stay within 10 kilometers, we're already capturing almost 9,000 households. Okay, so this is a summary of what we've said so far. So in 83, the region is unpopulated. 84, the contract is signed. The United Fruit Company is founded in 1899. Shortly afterwards, we have this dispute and the border is redrawn. We're going to talk about mechanism and what was happening in the company using historical data throughout its tenure, but it's only starting in 73 when we have this geocoded, very detailed census microdata. Okay, so the RD, I'm first going to show you the results of the RD pooling across years. So this is kind of an average effect of the company across years. And then we're going to see how the effect is changing as we move over across time. So on the left-hand side, you have the outcome of a household in census block, in household I in census block G in year T. Then we have this dummy that is one, if the centroid of census block G was inside the United Fruit Company. So gamma is going to capture the differences in outcomes between households in former United Fruit Company areas versus households in the control group. Then a polynomial that controls for things that are changing smoothly across space. And we have this vector of geographic and demographic controls and a year fixed effect, because in this one, again, we're first just pulling across years. This is the average effect when we pull across years. So the probability of an unsatisfied basic need is always lower if you are inside a former United Fruit Company area, meaning all these households that are in former United Fruit are better off, have better living standards on average, have lower probability of being poor, and less number of unsatisfied basic needs. Now, note that these are percentage points. Even if you think that these numbers are not too large, I think they're large, but some people have disagreed. You can look at the variation with respect to the mean, and now it's pretty evident that the difference is extremely, extremely large. Something that we do that at least I find very convincing is also we do a placebo test. So what is this placebo test? We shift the boundary. So here I'm going to show you when we shifted 2 kilometers, we have 1 kilometer, 4 kilometers in the paper, and then rerun the analysis within 2 kilometers of the fake boundary. So say we shifted 2 kilometers and then rerun the analysis within 2 kilometers of the fake boundary, so that all observations are on the same side of the true boundary. And we do this by shifting it up, shifting it down. Whenever we do that, the effect disappears. So it's something that is really changing exactly at the boundary. So if you're familiar with this critique of regression discontinuities, this is not just a spatial variation, and this placebo helps us speak to that, like the critique of Morgan Kelly, for instance. Now this is maybe the more interesting one, where we're seeing how the effect is varying across years. So now we're going to have one coefficient per year. This is the probability of being poor. I'm going to show you the rest of outcomes in the next slide, but they overall have the same sort of pattern. The effect starts really strong while the company is there, and then it slowly starts disappearing over time. But it's still significant in 2011 for many of the outcomes. So this is housing, health, education, consumption. Most of them have the same pattern. Now, outcomes like health or education are not significant anymore by 2011, consistent with like very heavy investments from the Costa Rican government in the 90s and 80s in this outcome, in like hospitals and schools. Okay, there's many robustness checks. We can go back to some of them later if you're interested. And now we're gonna talk about the mechanism. Okay, we documented these differences in outcomes. Now let's try to understand where are they coming from, why do they vary so sharply exactly at the boundary. And I'm gonna start with the mechanism for which we find more evidence, and that is the role of competition in the labor market. First of all, I'm gonna show you some qualitative evidence from archival research. And this evidence comes from company reports. There was one company report, and these were to inform shareholders and managers about the situations in the plantations. And during the early years of the company's tenure, they show a concern with attracting and maintaining a sizable workforce. So for instance, they say average worker turnover was only 3 months. There is constant overturn of labor. We're periodically importing new laborers. These migratory habits do not permit them to remain in the plantation from 1 year to the next. And as soon as they become physically efficient in their methods and acquire money, they return to their families and must be replaced. So it really seems like they struggle with keeping the workers working for the company, at least keeping them for a long period of time. Attracting them was hard. And why was turnover so high? Well, first of all, and during the company's early years of tenure, there were virtually no amenities in the region, so no worker wanted to move in with his or his family mostly. But also, it has to do with the outside option. The main outside option at the time for an agricultural worker was coffee. And like banana, coffee is a seasonal crop. So for 3-4 months a year, they could offer really high wages that would attract workers from the plantations. And so they had this constant, I would say, high outside option, once a year that would attract workers and make them leave the plantations. And then these reports talk about investments in local amenities as a solution to this constant overturn of labor. They say, we recommend a greater investment in corporate welfare beyond medical measures, and endeavor should be made to stabilize the population. We must not only build and maintain attractive and comfortable camps, but we must also provide measures for taking care of families of married men by furnishing them with gardens, schools, forms of entertainment. In other words, take an interest in our people if we might hope to retain them. And finally, statements just argue how this was actually successful. The strong investments, well, they stopped during the Depression, but they say we have poor resources into following these recommendations. Family housing served as an incentive for long service. Schools formed the cornerstone of child rearing. Lower turnover helped in fighting the spread of diseases. So overall, a story of high turnover, investments to attract workers and keep them in the region as a way to decrease to attract and maintain the workers. This is not only like anecdotal evidence from this or qualitative evidence from these reports. There's also empirical quantitative evidence that backs these statements. So first, we document a positive relationship between United Fruit Company's workers' outside options and current outcomes. So in areas where the United Fruit Company's workers had high outside options during United Fruit Company times, we see that like today, outcomes are better. Plausibly, like workers had better outside options. This led to more investments, more compensation in these areas where these workers had high outside options, consistent with better outcomes today. And this might, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but pretty much, so outside option, we model it depending on the wage of your neighbors. So we have current outcomes of household I in United Fruit Company Region J in year T, where T is kind of a current year. And then we regress that on wages, real wages in neighboring regions that are not part of the United Fruit, weighted by the inverse of distance. Of course, there's an endogeneity concern when regressing this on wages. So we use an IV strategy. In particular, our instrument is the suitability to grow coffee. And the idea is that regions that are more suitable to grow coffee, like neighboring regions that are more suitable to grow coffee, which grows in a different climate and altitude than banana, which is the company's main product, offered high wages for agricultural workers. So if you live close by to a region that was suitable to grow coffee, you had a high outside option, possibly receive more investments from the company, you have better outcomes today. And well, this is in the table form, but in the looking at this in a graph, areas with better outside options in general had better outcomes. So the lower probability of being poor and more satisfied basic needs in every of our outcomes. Then also we see that investments within the United Fruit were much larger than government investments in the control region. So if we're looking at spending per patient, it was 61% higher on average. Spending per student in schools was 33% higher on average. And housing provision was also, like the description of housing is that it was also much better than what the average agricultural worker had in the rest of the country. And importantly, access to all these amenities was restricted to United Fruit Company workers. So this might explain why we see this sharp discontinuity right at the boundary. Remember, the boundary, on one side you have United Fruit Company workers, on the other side you don't. And all these amenities were only accessible to these workers. So even if you were living a couple of blocks from the border, you couldn't just commute and go and have access to these services. Okay, so this pretty much the takeaway is that you have an outside option. There was an outside option and high turnover, which led to the need to attract and maintain workers, which induced these investments in what they called welfare, these investments in local amenities, and which could potentially explain the better living standards that we see today. This is actually the opposite to findings in situations with low mobility, even looking at the same company. So for instance, in Latin America, Guatemala and Colombia are two of the regions that received the lowest investments per capita in the entire region from the company. And there is qualitative evidence that mobility was very low in Colombia and Guatemala. So for instance, in Guatemala, there are letters from company officials to government officials saying, we don't want you to build roads connecting the plantations with other regions. And even today, this area where the United Fruit Company used to be is relatively disconnected from the rest of the country. In Colombia, there are well-documented cases when the government would send the army to prevent the workers from doing strikes and from leaving the plantation. So areas where this outside option was low, you couldn't basically leave or had a hard time if you wanted to leave. There's no need to attract and maintain workers. We don't see these investments in welfare, and they are actually among the poorest regions in Guatemala and Colombia, respectively, today. Okay, I'm just going to very briefly talk about alternative hypotheses. One of them, and the one I guess a lot of you might have in mind, is selective migration. What if we find better outcomes because just better people were selected into the company? Actually, when looking at migrants to the United Fruit Company, during United Fruit Company times, what we find is a negative selection as compared with migrants to the control group. So in 1973, for instance, this is kind of towards the end of the company's tenure, they had lower average years of schooling, 11% lower on average. And even if you think, okay, but this is towards the end, what happened at the beginning? Even going all the way back to 1927 and looking at the census there, we see that migrants to the United Fruit Company's region had lower average years of schooling, lower literacy, and a lower probability of owning real estate. So if anything, they seem negatively selected. Now you could think, okay, they were not great at school, but maybe they were amazing farmers. However, we find the same results, statistically the same results in subsamples in and out of the agricultural sector, which speaks against this story. And then finally, results are stronger in a subsample of UFC-born individuals, like suggesting this is not a migration effect, but a location effect. Something else that could have happened, this is the last alternative hypothesis I'll discuss. There are more in the paper. We can talk about more at the end. There could have been negative spillovers from the UFC to the control region, and that might be driving the results. However, we see that this region received statistically equal government spending than the mean rural region throughout the company's tenure. Outcome variables are very close to the country's mean. Actually, when we rerun DRD, as control versus other rural regions, coefficients are not significant. And finally, migrants to the control group have statistically equal observables as migrants to other rural regions. Even if we cut it as rural regions, agricultural regions, regions in general, they look statistically equal. So also speaking against this hypothesis. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the aggregate spatial model. So far, the empirical estimates that we talked about measure local effects, like effects like comparing this company's region versus like the nearby region, but don't tell us much about what was the aggregate effect at the country's level. So now we're going to build a general equilibrium spatial model to assess this aggregate effect. In particular, we're going to incorporate this key channel based on the empirical evidence. We're going to have a local monopsonist, meaning this is the only firm within its location that is going to attract workers into the region. And to do so, they're going to be able to provide a bundle of amenities. The model is going to highlight a key trade-off. In particular, the company's welfare effect can be positive or negative, depending on whether monopsonist distortions or the increasing investments to attract labor dominate. And it's going to allow us to run some counterfactuals to study how the firm's welfare effect depends on labor mobility and monopsony power, and on the ability of the government to substitute for the company in the provision of amenities. This is the structure of the model. We're going to have households that are mobile and can choose where to live to maximize their utility, subject to some mobility frictions. In the company's region, we're going to have, as I said, a local monopsonist, meaning it is the only firm within its location that can choose a bundle of wages and amenities to maximize profit. So the company is going to be able to choose whether they pay workers or attract workers by providing wage or amenities. Internalizing the effect that this has on the labor supply, of course. And the company will have access to a technology that locals do not have. And finally, the rest of the country is going to be very simple. Many regions where producers behave competitively, and this is consistent with what was happening in coffee. There were around 26,000 farms and 25,000 owners. And the government is going to collect taxes and invest in local amenities subject to a budget constraint. In particular, if this constraint is binding, and there's plenty of evidence that this constraint was binding for Costa Rica during the 20th century, in particular during the early years of the 20th century, the government will not be able to provide the optimal level of amenities to the rest of the country. Okay, going into more details. So we have n locations, time is discrete. Each agent is going to live for only one period. It's going to be born in the location of his or her parent, choose where to live and work so they can move. And then when they move, they work there, provide 1 unit of labor inelastically, have 1 offspring at the end of the period, and their period ends. So this structure is going to allow us to have an endogenous location choice and also have some persistence in labor shares across time. And so when the company decides to attract a worker, this is not only beneficial because you're going to have this unit of labor provided that period, but also you internalize that it's cheaper to keep a worker than to attract him given mobility frictions. And so you're taking into account that if you attract him, you also will have potentially his offspring next period. Workers consume with CS preferences across bundles of domestic and foreign goods, and they enjoy per capita local amenities that are going to be denoted with an A. Small a is per capita, and big A, like uppercase A, is amenities in region I. Letting PI be the CS price index, then the equilibrium deterministic utility is going to be a combination of the real wage, like the consumption or like the real wage in region I, and the amenities available in region I. There's going to be a bilateral moving cost, lambda, and some taste shocks. So idiosyncratic taste differences denoted by vector omega, that which implies that the utility of a worker living in I and moving to J is going to be determined by the shock, and then the utility and the bilateral moving cost. like the deterministic utility and the bilateral moving cost. And assuming, as is usual, that this omega is Frechet with a shape theta, we can then derive a gravity equation that tells us how how labor flows depend on the, labor flows from I to J depend on the utility in J, the initial labor in I, and the expected utility if this agent stays in I. Okay, so now to the producer side, I think the most interesting side here. So there are gonna be N regions. One of them is gonna be the United Fruit Companies region that is gonna produce a pure export good. And in the rest of regions, we'll have, as I said before, just producers that produce, that behave competitively, and they're gonna produce a domestic homogeneous good that can be sold both domestically and abroad. The UFC is a local monopsony that can choose a compensation bundle to compensate workers. So it can be composed of both wages and amenities. In the rest of the country, it's the government, the one that collects taxes and provides amenities. And we will assume that local amenities like schools and hospitals can also increase local productivity. So this is, I think, one of the most important slides of this section of the paper, of this section of the presentation, and tells us what is the firm's problem. So the firm, as I said before, it's the only one in its location, and it solves the following value function. So here A, remember, is amenities, and it will be as some sort of capital. So the firm is maximizing profits, and so it's producing, and then maximizing profits in order to, subject to attracting the optimal labor supply to its region, like in order to satisfy its optimal labor demand. So it can choose whether to pay with amenities, pay with wages, or provide amenities, and will choose the level such that they can attract enough people. Remember that these labor flows between regions will depend on the utility. In particular, you attract more people the larger the utility you provide in the United Fruit Companies region. And so why it would choose to pay either in wages or amenities. So let's ignore for a second this part right here, that amenities increase productivity. So the company wants to attract the worker in the cheapest possible way, and that is equalizing the marginal utility per dollar of consumption and amenities. So in that sense, the concavity of the utility function will move us away from a corner solution. If there are no amenities in the region, the company would have had to pay like an outrageous salary to attract them. Going back to these quotes, there were no amenities. It was extremely hard to keep workers put. And so equalize the marginal utility of consumption and amenities. Now, because amenities do increase productivity, this bundle is going to be tilted towards amenities. And how tilted it is will depend on this chi. Estimates of this chi that, say, the World Bank uses today date back to the 70s. Actually, and I think actually this setting is particularly well suited to try and estimate chi, and that's because you have a profit maximizing public goods producer that internalizes the effects of amenities. So that's going to be, I think, that's something interesting from the estimation. And then finally, just to mention, I'd like to talk briefly about market power in this case. So as I told you, this is the only firm in this location. So imagine there are workers working for the company. If these workers are completely immobile, the company is facing an inelastic labor supply. As this work, because this is the only company in the region, if you have no mobility, you have all these workers have to stay there. As workers become more and more mobile, the elasticity of the labor supply starts, so the labor supply curve starts becoming more and more elastic. And so kind of the market power of the elasticity of the labor supply the company faces will depend crucially on labor mobility. In the rest of the country, you'll have domestic producers that, as I said before, are very simple. They behave competitively. Their productivity is increasing also in local amenities, and they pay lump sum taxes to the government. And for the government, I'll have a very simple rule. They just collect taxes and provide amenities according to labor shares. And this is actually true in the data. If you see the dispersion between regions of spending per capita per year throughout the 20th century is actually extremely small. So this very simplistic rule actually seems to replicate well what is happening in the data.
So the government doesn't provide any amenities where the United Fruit Company is?
No, the government is only providing amenities in the rest of the country. Yeah, as I said, both in the model and in the setting, the government is not providing any kind of amenity in the United Fruit Company's region. That's correct. Okay, so this is just the definition of equilibrium. And then for the quantitative analysis, first in terms of estimation. So ideally, we would like to use this like linearized utility equation, let's call it, to infer via market clearing conditions the elasticity of labor mobility, the elasticity of substitution, and the weight of amenities in utility. And it happens that every one of these objects can be mapped to observables through market clearing conditions. So potentially, we could just run this regression right here. The problem, of course, is an endogeneity one. And so to go around it, we're just going to follow Allen and Donaldson and use what they call a model-based IV. It's not really indirect inference, but I'm not going to get into many details about this because it could take a while and it's not really our contribution, but you can think about it as it's not really indirect inference, but it's just maybe the closest thing if you're not familiar with their method. Basically involves using model-based objects of this that are not subject to this endogeneity and run this regression with them. And then for the rest of parameters in the model, we use a simulated method of moments that is going to exploit, mainly it's going to exploit the differences in labor shares, in quantities, in prices, in levels of investment between the United Fruit and regions in the rest of the country. So this is, let me see, we can be more concrete. So basically, this SMM is going to exploit, as I said, differences in labor shares, in levels of investment, in prices between the United Fruit and other regions. And so this is going to give us, our variation is mainly going to come from how things behave different in the United Fruit Company's region versus the rest of the country. And then there's going to be one of these moments that is going to come from our local RT in a very specific way. So if you remember what we were doing before with the local RT, we had these indices, say the probability of being poor, which is not something that we can map directly into a model object. There's no model equivalent of the probability of being poor. So instead what we're going to do is a projection of the probability of being poor on things that we can observe both in the model and in the data. And those are wage and the expenditure per capita in amenities by region. And so what we do is for districts on both sides of the United Fruit Company's border segment, where we run the RT, we calculate this gamma, that is the differences in the projected probability of being poor between the United Fruit Company and that region next to it, both in the data and in the model. And then this is going to be one of the moments that is going to allow us to discipline the model. Now we're going to start going over some counterfactuals. So in this counterfactual, I have the labor mobility elasticity on the x-axis and the United Fruit Company's aggregate welfare effect on the y-axis. Now, how do we get this estimate of the United Fruit Company's aggregate welfare effect? We compare welfare, in this case I have been describing, with a case where the United Fruit Company's region just looks exactly as any other region in Costa Rica. So we just give them the same technology, the government is the one that provides amenities, etc. in this region, and then we compare the differences in welfare. And the good thing about this is also that we're not just dropping the region, which could affect, like through the idiosyncratic shock could also be something that affects the result. We just assume this region looks like any other rural region. And then we see that as we increase the labor mobility elasticity, and you can see this a little bit like an outside option. So if the labor mobility elasticity is very low, the outside option of workers is very low. As this mobility, as this outside option starts increasing, the company's welfare effect starts increasing as well. And you can see that if the labor mobility is low, and you can imagine here Colombia, Guatemala, actually the company's effect can be negative. Exactly as it was happening in those places. In the Costa Rican case, given our estimation, it's actually positive, but this is not to say that these kind of companies are great. They should be invited into countries without any second thought. They can actually have a pretty negative effect if like workers' outside options are not sufficiently high. And just to remind you of this that I showed you before about outside options, this is kind of the model equivalent of this if you want. You have outside options and how as living standards are changing with these outside options. And now we're going to
Diana?
Yeah.
Excuse me, it's George. So just to understand, this is from like some stationary steady state?
Right.
So, I mean, if we thought about the transition, you know, I would think if everyone was outside the region and you had to attract them in the short run, this would have to be having these guys come in would have to be a very good thing.
So sorry, can you say that again? It got,
yeah.
Sorry, like just the end.
Yeah. No, I would think that if we did like the transition where we brought United Fruit into the region, that, and everyone had to move into that region, that this would be a good thing. Is there any way of kind of relating your the story you told about United Fruit and the model results to that kind of intuition?
Right. So like if you were thinking about, yes. So you're absolutely right. When we think about the transition, it becomes less clear because if say mobility is very low and the region to begin with is very empty, you would like this first wave of people would be very expensive. After that, the company could sort of strategically stop, like once you attract the people, they're kind of locked in there if mobility is extremely low. And so the immediate effect would be very different from the effect afterwards. But yeah, you're right. I'm not gonna look into the transition today, but this is true. There's a dynamic effect there that varies. Like if we're looking at the very like immediate like short run, and if you're looking at some periods into their tenure, yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, and so like a little bit talking about like say path dependence, this initial allocation then matters a lot in this transition that you're talking about. If there were people already there to start with, then it would have looked also very different, right? And then so the second counterfactual, we're going to look at the government's budget constraint. As I said before, the government is constrained by I'm calibrating a percentage of GDP that they can collect as taxes. And so what if I increase this percentage and allow them to collect potentially more taxes from the rest of the country? So if the government is constrained, like severely constrained, and I would say, I mean, 13% is pretty much what is being collected on average in Latin America today. So they were pretty constrained, but they're constrained, I would say, more generally. If the government is constrained, then the company's effect is positive because in the absence of the company, the government would not have been able to provide these amenities, even though the company is this monopsonist that is distorting, potentially distorting wages. They have this positive aspect of providing the amenities that the government couldn't have provided on its own. As the government is able to provide the amenities on its own, the company's effect becomes less and less positive until eventually it could become negative. So it's not as simple as these companies, like we find a positive effect, these companies are good, but actually there was an interaction between characteristics of the setting that led to this effect being positive. If you twist it, then actually they can be harmful for the economy.
So in essence, I mean, this is in your setup, the effect of providing amenities is good in terms of productivity, and it's good in terms of making your labor supply curve flatter, right? More elastic. So you don't want to use your monopsony power that much. So it's almost like a pre-commitment device to not use your monopsony power so much? Because first, there are two things going on. You choose amenities, and you choose these amenities knowing what those amenities are going to do to the shape of your labor supply curve to affect W, right?
So the shape of your labor supply curve, so you choose the amenities subject to the shape of your labor supply curve. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it's together, right? So you're taking into account the fact that I think that's my question. Is this timing that you're choosing amenities first and then you choose your labor, your wage, or is it that they're done simultaneously?
So no, they are done simultaneously. Like so you choose your amenities so you're so to say, you start the period with your stock of amenities, and then you choose how many amenities you're gonna have next year.
I mean,
exactly as with capital in a standard.
There might be another angle which would be sort of interesting, which is if I can pre-commit in terms of my amenities, because I build the roads, I build the schools, etc. Disinvest, reducing those amenities, it doesn't give me anything. Mm-hmm. So once I've invested in those amenities, then I know that people are going to come in, right? Be attracted here, and it'll affect my monopsony power as well. Mm-hmm. So it might be interesting to think what would happen if you change the timing a little bit.
Mm-hmm. The timing, like
first you choose
what
mm-hmm. and then you choose wages, because amenities are harder to move than wages. Mm-hmm. 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 So when you choose your amenities, you're taking into account the fact that your amenities are going to affect what looks like your labor supply curve. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it would be very interesting, I think. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, I think that's something that is very related to that, and that it's also, I found it very interesting, although it's not in the model right now, is that if you're talking about commitment, amenities is something you cannot back from. If you're thinking the company is not something that is super trusted, and then workers know that you cannot just destroy, you won't destroy the hospital. The hospital is going to be there next period. Exactly. So yeah, that's very interesting. Yes, I agree. Thank you. Just to conclude, so we talk about these large-scale multinational investments and how they can lead to positive and persistent effects on long-term growth. However, we also highlighted that there's a key role of workers' outside options and government constraints in determining the ultimate effect of these projects. And these results potentially have important policy recommendations for developing countries today. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So let's just open the floor to questions, comments, extended chat. Let's go ahead and unmute and jump in.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
So if you think about other countries, like, the Carolyn Freud has this thing about asparagus in Peru, right? Mm-hmm. How it was a new crop. And the sociologists here suggest, in the same, on this topic, suggest that because it was done in a plantation agriculture fashion, there were very few spillovers to the rest of the country. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering if you have any insights into, into that. I mean, your model suggests that it depends very much on how developed the rest of Peru was and what the outside options were for these workers.
Yeah, so actually I have a sort of a follow-up paper that is using, instead of population census, that is what I'm using here, it has agricultural census data that starts in the 60s, and basically it covers the universe of agricultural producers in the country, and is particularly about spillovers. So not only about spillovers while the company is operating, but when the company leaves and people from the company migrate to other regions, how do they impact, And so we see that, for instance, capital labor ratios sort of converge to what the company's labor ratios where in regions that receive more migrants and things like that. But that's it's another paper, but yes, a very interesting topic. Yeah.
Diana, I have a question. I'm sorry if I missed it when you said it because my computer wasn't working perfectly. But
I spoke very fast.
How did you estimate, how did you identify the elasticity of labor from within the company's region to outside?
So from within the company's region, so it's the same elasticity from any region to any other region, right? So,
right.
so
yes. So how do you estimate that?
So, okay, let me see here. So, yeah, it's not that you didn't hear. I just went over it very fast. I would say strategically because it can take a very long time to explain this in detail. But so this is the equation that relates once we have this idiosyncratic shock that relates utility to wages and amenities. And so if you just take a look at this equation, potentially you could identify the elasticity of labor mobility, what you asked about, also elasticity of substitution and the weight of amenities in utility just by sort of running this equation. And it happens that every element in this equation can be mapped to observables, in particular quantities, labor shares, through equilibrium conditions. However, there's this endogeneity concern that you have, I mean, yeah, there's like obvious endogeneity concern. And so we're going to use a model-based IV. And this is this strategy by Allen and Donaldson. And actually, in a new version of the paper, we're using another strategy, but these results are using Allen and Donaldson. And so let me just, so what is, I'm going to, in very broad terms, what is happening here? We pick some parameters, just initial values for these elasticities. And start a model simulation for the first year for which we have all the data that we need, and run the equation I just showed you, controlling for these initial labor shares and some geographic characteristics, and get a new vector of parameters from the model. So we basically rerun the equation in the model to obtain a new set of parameters. And then iterate until both elasticities coincide. I mean, this is, I understand it's very, I'm not getting into a lot of details. I saw Trev presenting this once and it took him like 15 minutes. I usually don't try to spend too much time on this, but it's pretty much a model-based IV. If you're familiar with indirect inference, is like a blend between indirect inference and without doing the indirect inference for this part. That's one way to put it. That's maybe not totally right, but to briefly explain it.
No, that's okay. I get the flavor of it. I would assume that your counterfactuals are highly sensitive to that, right?
Yes, so as you can see here, this effect basically depends crucially on what this elasticity is. So like this elasticity for the Costa Rican case is relatively high, and so we can see this aggregate effect that is positive. But if the elasticity was low, even having the RD, like the local RD that coincides with the one that we documented empirically in between these two regions, we could have a negative aggregate effect. Yeah, so this is also part of the kind of reasoning behind doing this counterfactual, that this elasticity is so key that we also want to see how the effect is changing through a set of different values.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
So Deanna, I have a question, which is, I think this went too fast. So what's the government's objective? They're choosing the A's in regions in order to set, that equation. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
The spending in a period, and so this is, again, A is kind of a capital. So the spending on capital in this period is going to just be whatever taxes you're collecting, and taxes are just calibrated to be a share of the GDP in the rest of the country. Like this, a share of this collected taxes that depends on the labor share of the region. So a region is going to receive like more of this like piece of like this amount of taxes if you have more labor in that region.
So, but is it only for regions that aren't part of the fruit company?
Right, like for the fruit company, the government is first not collecting taxes there, which is what was happening until 1956. They were not taxing the company, and it's also not providing amenities there.
I see. So the fact that P is 0 in the fruit company regions automatically gets you this. Okay.
Yeah, and I've entertained like several like rules for the government. So what I like about this one is very simple, and then it's also what I am seeing in the data that is happening. But if you have a government that behaves strategically, like, okay, let's maximize, say, the utility across regions, and then assign amenities that way, then you start with a, I would say, debate of, okay, shouldn't it be a best response problem then? Shouldn't the government invest more in regions that are very close to the company, so to say? And the company understand that and also be strategic about it, and then it can become a pretty complicated problem unless you take a stand on timing, like one of them decides first, and so
I see.
But
you said that in the data, this looks roughly correct, that spending is kind of proportional to size, more or less.
Right, exactly. And I don't see any strategic behavior like the government spending more in areas that are around the company either.
And does the company pay tax? I guess it's levied on GDP. So the company's included in GDP. And
no, here the company is not included in GDP. And in Costa Rica, it was true that until 1956, so the company started 1899. So for like roughly 60 years into their tenure, they didn't pay taxes. After that, they started paying a share of profits as tax. But
so the only thing they got out of the company is the railroad. Everything, but after that, they didn't pay tax until the 50s. I see. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that much about Costa Rica, but was it a dictatorship at any point here, or was it a democracy throughout? Or
so it like during the 20th century, it had a brief period of dictatorship. Almost nothing. If you compare it with other regions in Latin America, it was a democracy for most of the 20th century, pretty much like the gold standard of democracy in Central America. And that might have also been important, right, in terms of institutions. Like if you were thinking mobility in Guatemala or Colombia was very low, but why was it so low? Because I mean, the government allowed basically the company to
fruit company
like the government basically like would send the army to prevent people from leaving, or like not build the roads connecting that region with other regions. And so that institutional part played a role in the mobility, right?
I mean, that's why they were called banana republics, right?
Right.
Diana, I have a quick question.
Hi.
Hey, enjoyed it a lot. So this is a boring question. The particular border adjustment that you exploited, I mean, the reason we find it interesting is that the worry that maybe the company would have chosen the area strategically, right? The more fertile and sort of better part of the country. And then you had the entire border RD as a robustness, but I would expect the difference between the RD from the entire border and that particular sort of baseline value estimate as informative. We would expect the entire border effect to be larger.
That's exactly right. If we do the RD in the entire border, the effect is larger, like the percentage variation with respect to the mean is larger. Exactly because of what you're saying. Like, I mean, one can think that it's because it's contaminated by the fact that the land was better to start with, so to say.
Yeah, this is reassuring. Just wanted to check that. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen.
Okay, so let's call this the official end of the seminar. We'll leave the channel open and people can keep talking if they like. Just a reminder, next week, same time, same channel. The speaker is Laura Alfaro talking about elusive safety, the new geography of capital flows and risk. So that will be for next week. Thank you everybody for coming, and we'll leave the channel open for any further discussions.
2 Costa Ricans in a row.
That's right. And 2 geography papers in a row, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Good, good.
So Deanna, this is George again. I enjoyed the paper. I want to come back to like this kind of transition thing. You sort of set it up like these guys could really abuse their workers, right? But it, you know, in any sort of model, like where you have switching costs and you have to kind of attract people, it's really hard to, you may kind of exploit them on the back end, but everything you did to sort of attract them kind of offsets kind of that back end. And so, you know, from a welfare perspective, this has to be a good thing, bringing United Fruit in, unless there's some differences in like discount factors or something like that, where people aren't thinking about the future. So have you given, you know, some thought to why that's not the right way to think about that, or?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. As long as you have these idiosyncratic shocks that are not extremely low. Otherwise, I mean, if the idiosyncratic shocks are like, say, like close to zero, I mean, if the idiosyncratic shocks are very low, then this would prevent people from seeing the value in these other locations, even if it was there. But yeah, like given some like relatively normal mobility, I think you're right. I mean, bringing the company, like if you think about the extreme case where there are no mobility frictions, you are just bringing one additional company to compete, and so it cannot be bad for welfare. It's when you introduce the mobility frictions, and again, it will depend on your starting point. If the region is empty, you have to attract them. And so at least for one period when you're attracting them, you might offer something really good. Thereafter, you could not, right?
Right, but I mean, but if the agent's, you know, solving the dynamic programming problem themselves, then they fully internalize being held up in the future. And so even if they kind of do, so they don't worry about that in the long run, even if that's the case.
Right, like in the model as it is now, agents live for one period, and even though they have an offspring, they don't really have this paternalistic, like they don't care about this offspring.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, if they were solving a dynamic problem, then sure, and assuming the company cannot sort of cheat something that maybe they were doing, but assuming it cannot cheat, yeah, you're right.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think the literature on switching costs did a lot of work on this, and kind of speaks to some of these issues. And then just the second question I had was just on the government budget constraints. So these things actually generated no revenue for the government.
So it depends on what year you're looking at. If you're looking at the first like 50 years of the 20th century, no. But afterwards, so there was kind of this local revolution, and the new government was like thought very differently from the last one, and they actually started taxing the company, but not before that.
But there weren't even taxes on banana exports or like on shipping, you know, or port fees or anything like that. That really these were the only guys paying it.
So they were managing the port themselves, but yeah, there were no taxes on banana exports. And then in the 50s, what happened was there were taxes, but only to profits, and it was just 15%. And yeah, and in part it's kind of good that there were no taxes at the beginning on profits in particular, because then you could think that a lot of these investments were just ways to avoid taxes, and inflating investments would mean maybe that you're paying less taxes, and that could contaminate also the analysis. But no, in the first 50 years, they were not paying any taxes.